So at some point in Hyrule's past, the Zonai descended upon the land and either established or re-established the Kingdom of Hyrule as we know it in the latter games. That is established lore. As some of you know, the point in time of this Zonai emergence is uncertain, much to the frustration of us lore junkies. But there are basically 3 currently theorized locations in time for the Zonai emergence to have taken place. The first time is before Skyward Sword, which doesn't make a ton of sense because Hyrule appears to be relatively peaceful in much of the Zonai era, and because Ganondorf as we know him is a product of the Curse of Demise, which isn't in place yet before Skyward Sword. The second possible time is somewhere between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, which doesn't make a ton of sense either because that would propose that there would be 2 temples of time existing at the same time, and because there is no evidence of the Zonai in any of the games between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, those games being Minish Cap and Four Swords. The third possible time is before Breath of the Wild but after all the other games, which also doesn't make sense because while the ruins of ancient Hyrule are plentiful, going all the way back to Skyward Sword, literally tens of thousands of years ago, there are very few Zonai ruins around, despite the Zonai emergence being a much more recent occurrence. Now, all of these possible locations in time occur while the Zelda timeline is merged, and I propose that we are looking in the wrong place. Since no one's been able to find a satisfying location for the Zonai emergence in the merged sections of the timeline, by simple logical reasoning, I think we can say that the Zonai probably came along while the timeline was split. We are assuming for the purposes of this theory that all the separate timelines merged again prior to Breath of the Wild, as that is the currently generally agreed upon theory. So far, I don't think I've said anything too outlandish, but like all y'all, I crave detail, and so I wanted to know which split timeline the Zonai are from and where in that timeline. And after a little bit too much searching, I literally have no idea. There's still no hint that these guys existed in any of the previous games, which makes sense because Nintendo didn't come up with them until Breath of the Wild and didn't flesh them out until Tears of the Kingdom, but the point is there isn't really a plausible way to theorize connections between them and any of the 3 split timelines. There's maybe subtle hinting at a connection between the Zonai and the Twilight and Twilight Princess, but not enough to say anything with any degree of certainty. Then I had a realization of a solution that is so simple that I am genuinely surprised that nobody else thought of it first. It's incredibly on brand for the Zelda timeline and quite frankly just makes sense. The Zonai are from a 4th split timeline. And now someone's probably going to get mad because the Zelda lore was convoluted enough with 3 timelines, but I think you'll see that it might be worth it. Now, canonically, there are only 3 timelines, or rather I might say that there are only 3 timelines that we know of. All of the games and existing lore of The Legends of Zelda occur within the 3 timelines, or in the time before their separation or in the time after they are reconjoined. What I am proposing in essence is the existence of 1 or more additional timelines that are as much a part of the Zelda universe as the timelines that we already know, but that aren't part of any of the currently existing games or lore. We will be referring to these hypothesized timelines as shadow timelines for the rest of this video. By the time of Breath of the Wild, all timelines, including any possible shadow timelines, would be perfectly merged back into the main timeline alongside the 3 established timelines. This merging would result in the remnants of a shadow timeline being transmitted into the main timeline without the events of the shadow timeline ever having to have occurred as we know it. We see some evidence of the Zonai's existence in Tears, but certain rather important details seem to be missing, namely the Zonai Castle. But if the Zonai only descended to Hyrule in a shadow timeline, then all is well and good, because the shadow timeline would be competing with at least 3 other timelines in the merging, and some stuff would inevitably be lost. All the lore from the Zonai timeline would be intact, the same as in the other 3 timelines, but obviously the 3 timelines have some geographical differences, so it would canonically speaking make a lot of sense if certain notable structures in the Zonai timeline were conveniently destroyed at some point leading up to the merging. Which explains why there's well-preserved Zonai mechs and structures in Tears, but no sign of the Zonai Castle. One problem that may occur to you is that this means that there isn't an obvious bloodline connection between Zelda and Queen Sonia, because we know in the established lore that there is one, but that is less of a problem than you'd think. First of all, Queen Sonia could be part of the lineage of Hylia, in which case she would essentially be the Zelda of her timeline in every way other than name, the same way that Tetra was in Wind Waker. That makes a lot of sense, as we see that Sonia carries some form of many of the past abilities of other Zeldas. Access to divine energy, the ability to manipulate time to some extent, and possibly some other, more minor magical abilities. It also explains the whole thing about them having a blood connection, but Sonia not having a child that we know of in Tears. This solves that problem. But for the sake of argument, let's suppose that maybe she's not, and that Queen Sonia might just be some gal that happens to have Zelda as a descendant. That may seem, then, like a coincidence that they share a family tree, but it's really not. The timelines merged prior to Calamity Ganon's first attack 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild, and I don't think that we really take the time to think about how long that is. Zelda obviously had two parents, who each also had two parents, who each also had two parents, etc., etc., and since Hylians don't live much longer than normal humans, the generations can't feasibly be much longer than 40 years apiece, meaning that there have been around 250 generations at the low end between the original battle with Calamity Ganon and the current day. By this logic, Zelda has at least one Quattuorvigintillion ancestors per generation if you go back to the time of the original battle with Calamity Ganon. That's 1 with 75 zeros after it, and it's more than the population of Hyrule has ever been. By simple process of logic, it makes perfect sense that if you go back to the time of the Zonai in this hypothetical Shadow timeline, Zelda would have a blood connection to almost every living Hylian in the world. So regardless of Queen Sonia's position or lack thereof within the lineage of Hylia, the existence of a blood connection makes sense. Of course, this theory is still pretty up in the air if I can't prove that at least one Shadow timeline exists. And I'll admit that I can't actually prove it. But I can list 3 points in the Zelda timeline where there may have been a hidden timeline split. The first, and I think most plausible option, is that there were additional timeline splits in Ocarina of Time aside from the 3 established ones. This theory comes from Nintendo World TV. It's a very well put together theory, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description. The theory basically proposes that every time that Link goes to the past, it causes a new timeline split, because he leaves the present-day world as we know it without a hero. This would result in many Shadow timelines, all vaguely resembling the Downfall timeline, splitting off from Ocarina of Time. One thing that Nintendo World TV didn't mention, however, is that this logic would by necessity also extend to Majora's Mask. Each time that Link uses the Ocarina and Termina, there would be a new timeline in which Termina was destroyed, but that would otherwise mirror the Child Link timeline until Twilight Princess, when the Hero of Time's Spectre would not exist to aid the Hero of Twilight, and the world of Hyrule would probably be plunged into an age of eternal edginess. This latter possibility is particularly interesting because the Zonai either founded or refounded Hyrule, and as we've pretty much established that they couldn't have been the original founders thanks to the events of Skyward Sword, they must have rebuilt Hyrule in some sense, which by necessity means that there must have been some kingdom-destroying event prior to their coming. If a Shadow timeline off of Majora's Mask resulted in the later failure of the Hero of Twilight, and Hyrule fell before the Twilight invasion, then that's a solid apocalyptic event to herald in the era of the Zonai, and a war between the Zonai and the Twilight would definitely explain why the Zonai are nearly extinct by the time that Zelda arrives via time reversal in their kingdom. However, if you are unconvinced, I've still got 2 more possible locations for a timeline split, and it may be that there are others that I'm just not thinking of. The second possible timeline split is all the way back in Skyward Sword. In Skyward, Zelda goes back in time to go into a 1,000-year slumber to hold the seal on Demise. Following the logic from Ocarina of Time, Zelda going back in time should hypothetically create a timeline split. This one is on far shakier grounds than the last one, though, because Zelda goes back in time and later returns to the present within the same timeline. This seems to imply that the timeline did not split at this point in Skyward Sword, but it's hard to say. At that point in the story, Zelda was basically a pure-blood demigoddess of time, so she could probably do whatever she wanted to the timeline within reason. If she wanted to go back in time without splitting the timeline, she probably could. However, if the timeline did split there, then in the Shadow timeline, Link could have still sought out the Triforce and destroyed Demise, but Girahim would have still been around, and who knows what villainy he would have gotten up to. The third and final point that I found where there could possibly be another timeline split is an Oracle of Ages. In Oracle of Ages, there are a lot of time travel shenanigans that are mainly caused either by the dark sorceress Varen mind-controlling Nehru, who is the Oracle of Ages, or by Link using the Harp of Ages. However, time travel seems to work somewhat differently in the Oracle games, which I guess makes sense because the time travel in these games comes from an entirely different source than previously, and wouldn't normally have anything to do with the realm of Hyrule itself. Anyway, when Varen changes the flow of time using Nehru, a new timeline doesn't immediately spring into being. Instead, the existing timeline begins to shift towards what would have happened had those changes always been the case. Kind of like the first Back to the Future movie, but in reverse. It doesn't make any literal sense, but that's how the time travel works in this game. However, when Link uses the Harp of Ages to alter the timeline, the change appears to be instantaneous, which is weird because the Harp of Ages was probably made by Nehru, so you'd think that their rules of time travel would be the same, but apparently they're not. It is worth noting, though, that despite the instantaneous timeline update, the Harp of Ages doesn't function quite the same way as the Ocarina of Time. The Ocarina allowed Link to travel back in time, but only into his younger former self. On the other hand, the Harp of Ages allows Link to travel hundreds of years further back in time than the date of his birth. Also in the Oracle games, the character Ralph is a descendant of Queen Ambi, and because of this, if Ambi was killed, then Ralph would cease to exist. This implies that there is still some connection between the original order of events in the past and the nature of things in the present, even if the present had previously had a different past. So could there be a timeline split in Oracle of Ages? I don't know. The Oracle games have by far the most convoluted time travel system out of any of these games, but with all of the different ways in which time is manipulated in this game, I'm leaving it on the list. And as I conclude the possible starting points of Shadow timelines, I'd like to point out that these three are just the possible timeline splits that I was able to find as someone who's played less than a third of the Zelda games. So there may be others that I've missed. To summarize this theory, though, the Zonai didn't descend to Hyrule in the merged timeline or in the three established split timelines. They descended in a fourth timeline that we otherwise know almost nothing about. This Shadow timeline was probably split from the existing chronology during the events of Ocarina of Time, or more likely Majora's Mask, but alternatively may have been split from the events of Skyward Sword or even Oracle of Ages. When the timelines merged prior to Breath of the Wild, the lore and the history of the Shadow timeline fused seamlessly into that timeline in the same way as the other three timelines, but due to geographical inconsistency with the other timelines, some notable landmarks from the Shadow timeline were lost. To my mind, this is the most satisfying explanation for the origin of the Zonai, and there isn't an existing point in the chronology where they could have appeared without retconning or plot holes. I hope you enjoyed, because that's all for the day. If you've got any thoughts about supporting evidence or potential plot holes or alternative timeline splits that I didn't cover in this theory, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Without further ado, bye.